I did not expect to leave home on my 18th birthday with a duffel bag and a folder of documents, but by the time the candles stopped smoking and the guests pretended not to stare, I had already decided. My sister's tantrum was loud enough to echo off the privacy fence and carry down our cul-de-sac, and my choice in response was the quietest thing I have ever done. I walked upstairs, zipped my bag, and carried it out past the sagging balloons while everyone argued over who had ruined what. The party had started fine in that suburban Ohio way where the grill never really cools off and the dads drift inside when the baseball game gets good. My father kept stepping in and out of the living room to watch the Guardians on TV and call out the score. My mother fussed with the buttercream on the sheet cake she bought from the grocery store bakery, and our neighbor Mr. Dorsey leaned over the fence to ask whether we needed another bag of ice because the corner store had a sale. It was the first Saturday after Labor Day, warm enough that the mosquitoes were still ambitious, and my friends from school had pushed the folding tables together to make one long crooked line down the driveway. The gift I had wanted most was not the car my parents kept hinting about, but a simple promise that the day would stay calm and intact and mine. Then Mariah arrived 20 minutes late with her sunglasses pushed into her hair and a smile that meant she was already annoyed about something, and calm left the yard like smoke on a windy day. She started small, picking at the playlist, switching my friend's country songs to some moody pop track and turning the volume up without asking. She shifted the gift bags so the one from her sat on top like a crown, and when my mother called everyone over to sing, she squeezed between my friends with her phone held high so she could film herself instead of me. I tried to keep my shoulders loose and my face easy. "It's fine," I said to my best friend Lauren when she whispered, "Do you want me to block her?" Then the cake knife went missing. My mother asked if anyone had moved it. I saw the handle sticking out from under a stack of plates where Mariah had slid it and pretended not to notice. "Let her have her fun," my father muttered, eyes flicking to a double in the bottom of the seventh, and the tight feeling traveled up the back of my neck the way it does when you know your cheeks are going to get hot and there is nothing you can do to stop it. The gift moment snapped whatever was left of the day. My parents handed me a little jewelry box with a key inside, shiny and light, and everyone clapped because everyone knew what it meant. There was a used Civic parked around the corner. The one my father had found from a guy at church after service the previous Sunday, and he had already changed the oil himself. I did not cry because I was trying not to make it a spectacle. "Thank you," I said, steady, even, and then Mariah rolled her eyes and said from behind her phone, "Must be nice to be the princess for once." People laughed in that nervous way they do when they hope it is a joke. She stepped forward, reached for the key, and said, "Let me see, I just want to see," and when I did not hand it over, her hand darted out and the key dropped, bounced once on the concrete, and skittered under the beverage tub. The sound it made was sharper than it should have been. My mother hissed her name. My father said, "Enough," but he said it to the air, not to her. "You ruined my engagement dinner last month just by wearing white," Mariah said to me like she had been saving it, and then she did the thing she knows always gets to my mother. She pressed her palms to her eyes and cried. Not loud sobs, just those tight breaths that make other women rush in with napkins and soft voices. "I can't do this today," she said. "I can't keep pretending she doesn't take everything I have." What happened next lived on in small-town gossip for the next 2 weeks, because there were witnesses and camera phones and a noise complaint. Anthony scolded me for antagonizing, which I later learned meant that I tried to keep the key from sliding deeper under the metal tub and bumped the table so the lemonade sloshed onto Mariah's sandals. Someone's toddler cried. The dog barked like the world was ending. My mother, who had been pacing like a referee in a game she did not understand, slammed the pantry door so hard that the cheap clock fell off the nail, and my father raised his voice finally and told everyone to stop acting foolish. which only made the air feel hotter because he only yells when the grass catches fire every few summers. Then there was siren chirp from the end of the street. A patrol car idled by the curb. A young officer leaned over the gate and asked whose party this was because a neighbor had called in yelling on a Saturday, and when my mother bobbed and stepped back, his eyes landed on me, the girl in front of a cake with her name in blue icing, and he said, "Ma'am, just keep it down," and handed me a paper with a box checked for warning. Mariah sniffed, dabbed her eyes with a napkin, and whispered to Lauren as if the officer could not hear, "Told you she doesn't know how to behave." I stood there with my hands damp and sticky from fishing under the tub for that stupid key, and in the second before anyone else said another thing, I realized I was done. I did not throw anything or raise my voice. I nodded, told the officer we would be quieter, and walked into my house. Packing did not take long because my life fit in 2 bags when I stripped it down to essentials. I folded jeans and the sweatshirt with the school logo that still smelled like last Friday night's bonfire, tucked my birth certificate and social security card into a folder because the counselor had told us to keep originals together once we turned 18, slid my community college course schedule into the front pocket, and paused at the door long enough to listen. Downstairs, my mother said, "This is exactly what I was worried about," and my father's voice had that tired shape it gets when he has run out of patience. I grabbed the envelope with the scholarship letter from the PDA because the check came at the end of the month if the hours were verified, and I needed that money more than I had ever needed anything. I took one last look at the photo strip tucked into my mirror frame, the one with me and Lauren making faces at a church carnival, and I left my house without a word. The sun had ducked behind the maples. The street was soft with that early evening gold that makes everything look prettier than it is. I walked the 2 miles to the efficiency I had found on the first Monday of the month behind the thrift store near the bus line, a place that smelled faintly like old books and pine sol, but had a lock that turned and a window that opened. Sunday came with the church bells from St. Luke's 2 blocks away, and the ache of a headache from the sweetness of the frosting and the weight of a decision that settled in my shoulders like I had carried too many groceries at once. My phone lit up before the first service let out. 3 texts from my mother full of sweeping statements about family and respect, 1 from my father asking where the spare key was, 2 from Mariah that went from brittle to syrupy in the space of 10 minutes. "You're being dramatic," she wrote. "Let's just act normal. People were watching." Also, I told Antonisi would apologize for making a scene. I put the phone face down and listened to the local radio news hum about a bake sale for the marching band, a lane closure on I-71, and a feature about a retired teacher turning 90. The familiar cadence steadied me more than prayer did that morning. I walked to the little diner on Main where the cook knew I liked my eggs over medium, and I practiced the talk I thought I might have with my parents later, the one where I would ask for space and boundaries and less pretending. Monday made any soft plan feel naive. I went back to the house at noon when I knew my parents would be at work because I needed my last box of textbooks and the cork board with my notes for a speech class. Mariah was home, barefoot on the couch with a mug that wasn't hers, scrolling. She did not look up. "I'll be fast," I said. "Take your time," she answered, voice bright with that false cheer that always hides a barb. I moved down the hall, picked up my box, and caught a detail in the corner of my eye that made my stomach go cold. A stack of PDA volunteer sign-in sheets on my old desk with my name printed in neat block letters, and next to it, another sheet with the same tally marks and dates, but the name at the top said Mariah Carter. The signatures looked like mine. My throat went dry. I slid one sheet into my folder and said nothing because I did not trust my voice to come out even. Before I reached the front door, she called out, "You left a mess back there, by the way," and when I turned, she tilted her head and smiled like we were children again and she had taken the last cookie. I already fixed it, she said. You're welcome. It got worse the way things do when you try to fix one piece and the rest shift under your hands. On Tuesday after the PTA meeting, Mrs. Klein pulled me aside with a careful smile tightened by duty. Your scholarship hours are under review, she said, speaking low so the moms at the folding table wouldn't hear. We had 2 sets of forms with your name and 2 different pens, and one of the sign-ins at the food pantry has a timestamp after closing. I know you've been there on Saturdays, but we have to verify everything before we can cut checks. It's standard. I nodded even though the edges of my vision felt fuzzy. The food pantry closed at 2 o'clock on the 3rd Saturday of the month. I knew because I had carried 50-pound bags of potatoes until my forearms ached and I had swept the entryway while the coordinator locked up. I can bring proof, I said. I have photos on my phone of the donation lists and the date on the cork board. She patted my arm like she was smoothing down a wrinkle in a dress. Great, she said. We just want everything to match. As I stepped outside into the heat, the church bell across the street chimed noon, and the smell of the taco truck in the parking lot turned my stomach. By Wednesday, the police warning from my party turned into a $125 citation because the officer had checked the host responsible box next to my name, and the city's online portal did not care who cried near a cake. My father left me a voicemail that sounded like he was older than he had been the week before. You need to take care of your mess, he said. It came to the house. That night, Lauren texted to say she could not hang out because her mother had told her it was better to give our family space while we sort things out, which I translated as, Mariah has been talking. I could feel my hands start to sweat whenever I thought about it, and when I lay down to sleep, high-pitched sounds, pipes in the wall, a car door banging somewhere, would make me flinch like someone had shouted in my ear. The thing that flipped my instinct from hiding to gathering proof came on the last Thursday before payday, when an alert popped up from the credit monitoring app one had installed back in May when the school counselor walked us through FAFSA. New account opened, it said, polite and neutral, and then it listed a buy now pay later line I had never heard of in my name for a purchase at a boutique 2 towns over. The amount sat there like a dare, $742. 83 due in 4 installments. I closed my eyes and said my sister's name out loud once, slowly, as if it were a word in a language I was just now learning to pronounce clearly. I called the customer service number and listened to the hold music while a ceiling fan clacked in the apartment upstairs. When the representative came on, cheerful and distant, I gave my name and date of birth and said I needed to dispute an account. She recited the policy in that careful way that means we've seen this before, and told me where to upload my driver's license and a written statement. You'll want to file a police report, she added. It speeds things up. The thought of walking into the station with a story that involved my sister made my chest tighten, but the idea of doing nothing felt worse. Friday evening, I drove by the house because I had to pick up my fall jacket from the hall closet before the temperature dipped. The garage door was up. A hastily lettered sign leaned against a box. Saturday garage sale, 8 a.m. My mother's handwriting. Another sign listed items. Designer purse, never used, size 6 boots, new with tags. My heart thumped once, hard. In that way you feel behind your ribs when your body is trying to get your attention. Mariah's boots were size 7. I was size 6. I parked down the block and sat there thinking about how many things could be true at once. My parents were trying to pay for the party and a winter gas bill. My sister liked nice things and rarely paid for them herself. The PTA scholarship committee needed clean paperwork, and I was trying not to drown in a month that felt longer than the summer before it. When I finally went inside, I reached past the coats and grabbed my jacket, and there on the shelf under the stack of hats sat the little shoebox where I kept a folder of receipts from volunteer days. Photos printed at the drugstore because the pantry coordinator preferred paper documentation and a copy of my first car insurance quote. The box was lighter than it should have been. The folder was thinner. Half the pages were gone. The sound that came out of me was not a cry. It was more like a breath punched out of a tire. I stood there with the closet door open and the smell of dust in my nose, and I remembered Mrs. Klein's patient eyes and the ink of Mariah's neat block letters on the sign-in sheet on my desk. I closed the door gently and walked out without speaking to anyone in the living room, where the baseball pregame show hummed and my father clicked through channels. On the first Monday of October, a week and 2 days after my birthday, I took a notebook to the library and wrote down everything I knew in a steady hand that made my fingers hurt because I pressed too hard. Dates, times, names, places, small facts like the way the pantry coordinator, Mr. Blake, wrote his capital B like a heart missing a side, and the way the garage door sticks unless you lift from the left. I made a list of proof I could gather without setting foot in the house again, and a list of questions to ask people who did not owe my family anything. I pulled the PTA email from my inbox and read it twice to memorize the exact words under review, so I would not change them in my head to something worse. I looked at the police report form online and told myself I could manage a simple truth without turning it into a family war. Then I turned off my phone, put both hands flat on the laminate table, and sat very still until the feeling in my arms returned. What I planned next would not look like a plan to anyone watching. It would look like a girl minding her business. That was fine with me. Quiet has its own weight. Quiet, done right, moves the heavy things. By the second Saturday of the month, the garage sale signs were staked into the strip of grass by our mailbox, and I stood half a block away with a cup of gas station coffee and watched people drift in like the tide you get on warm fall mornings when folks are itching to haggle. I stayed on the sidewalk because I did not want anyone to say I had made a scene, and I kept the cup in both hands because they were shaky from not enough sleep and too much thinking. From where I stood, I could see the long folding tables set up in the driveway, a row of purses hung from the ladder my father used to clean the gutters, and a garment rack that did not belong to us loaded with dresses that still had their paper tags, the small white squares dangling like reminders. My mother worked the table with the cash box in her lap, and Mariah did the usual dance with the customers where she pretended to be shy and then became the star when she talked price. A woman in a red sweatshirt picked up a purse and asked if the strap was adjustable, and I watched my sister demonstrate like she was at a department store. She even slipped the bag over her shoulder and turned a little so the light would catch it. When the woman counted out $40, my mother dropped the bills into an envelope with a label I could not read from where I stood. My coffee cooled while I counted how many new with tags items left the yard in less than an hour, and twice I saw bags from the boutique 2 towns over, a store I had walked past on my way to the library and never had the courage to step into because the window displays made my throat tight with a mix of want and common sense. I did not march up and accuse anyone of anything because I grew up learning that in our family the person who speaks the loudest looks the worst, and I had already been cast in that part without opening my mouth. Instead, I waited for a neighbor to ask the kind of question that pulls the string. It happened around 10 when Mr. Dorsey wandered over from his yard with a coil of extension cord over his shoulder. He has a way of asking about the weather and managing to collect useful details about everything else. "Good turnout," he said, nodding at the line by the table. "You two find these in your closets?" My mother said yes too fast, and Mariah laughed like a bell. "We're simplifying," she said. "Trying to make room. People collect more than they need." Mr. Dorsey took his time looking at the garment rack, reached for the price tag on a navy dress, and squinted. "These look brand new," he said. Almost like someone forgot to take off the paper. He said someone like a person who fixes fences, not a detective, but my mother's shoulders lifted anyway. He set the dress back and said, "Good for you," turning clutter into cash, and walked away, and I could feel my jaw loosen because I had learned something from her face that was better than any argument. She was nervous about the wrong thing. Around noon, I crossed to the other side of the street and stood in the shade where I could see if anyone I knew from the PDA stopped by. At the end of the table, under a stack of baking pans, I recognized the tin I had used for the food pantry fundraiser last spring with my name written on masking tape along the side. A woman in a green ball cap picked it up and asked if it was still $2, and when Mariah said yes, the woman said, "I bid on this at the church last time," and laughed. I let the moment pass because I wanted the sound and the image more than I wanted a scene. I took a photo from the sidewalk that showed the purse with the tag, the garment rack with sizes, and the envelope with my mother's handwriting. When my coffee cup was empty and the sun had swung far enough to warm the back of my neck, I walked away without speaking to anyone and drove to the boutique because I had a question a manager could answer in plain language without the family part messing it up. The boutique smelled like expensive candles and pressed cotton, and the kind of music they play in stores when they want you to take your time and not think about money. I kept my hands folded over my purse strap because I did not want to touch anything I could not afford. A clerk with neat eyebrows and patient eyes greeted me near the jewelry case. I bought a keychain for $6, the cheapest thing there, and then I asked if customers who used the buy now pay later option had to show ID or sign anything special. She smiled and said she could not share specific store policies, and I said I understood, and I told her someone had opened a line with my name for a purchase here on the last Thursday before payday, and I had filed a dispute. I did not say my sister. I did not say our address. I said only dates and a case number. She looked at me the way nurses look at patients when they are trying to be kind and efficient. She said a manager could speak with me, and the manager came out with a tablet and a long look that weighed my request. "I can't pull up accounts without a formal request from law enforcement," she said. "I can tell you we have cameras at the register, and when there's an active investigation, we cooperate. If you have a report number, include it when you file your dispute." She wrote down the email for their loss prevention contact and slid it over with 2 fingers. "I'm sorry this is happening," she said. "I see it more than you'd think." The police station smelled like floor cleaner and coffee that had cooked too long on a hot plate. I took a number like I was at the BMV and sat under a TV that scrolled local news about a new stop sign by the high school and a homecoming parade route that would close Main Street for 3 hours next Friday. When my number came up, I explained what I had found, and the desk officer typed steadily and asked me to slow down when I spoke too fast. I told him about the buy now pay later account, the missing sign-in sheets, the scholarship delay, and the garage sale with new items. I did not accuse anyone by name. I used the words "I believe" and "I noticed," and "here are the dates." He gave me a case number and told me to attach screenshots and copies when I got home. "Do you know who did it?" he asked, not unkindly. I took a breath and felt that familiar tightness at the base of my throat when I try to say something my body does not want to say. "I have a strong suspicion," I answered. "They live at my parents' address." He nodded and said he would include it and that I should call if I received any more alerts. "Identity theft is common," he said. "Family cases are tough. Stay calm, keep records, be patient." The word patient made my shoulders lock because waiting had never saved me before, but I nodded because the plan I had did not look like action to anyone else, and I needed to practice carrying that secret. On the Tuesday after the PTA meeting, Mrs. Klein called me at lunch and said she had spoken with the pantry coordinator and the timing issue was still under discussion. Which is how people here say we think something is off, but we do not want to accuse anyone in a town where the same people run into each other at church and the grocery store and the football field. I asked if I could bring in letters from supervisors and photos of the volunteer logs I had taken with the date stamps visible. She said yes, and her voice softened when she said she hoped to have it settled by the second weekend, because that is when the committee issued checks to the award students. When I hung up, I realized my hands were sticky because the peaches at the farmer's market stand outside the library had been softer than they looked, and the juice had run down my fingers while I talked. I wiped my palms on a napkin and felt tired in a way that started in my bones and made walking feel like waiting. The ally I did not expect turned out to be the pantry coordinator, Mr. Blake, who is the kind of person you do not notice until he speaks, because he always wears the same faded green cap and a shirt that says "Serve First," and moves like a man who has learned to save steps. He asked me to come by on Thursday afternoon when the line was short, and he had a minute between deliveries. I sat on a plastic chair in the back room that smells like onions and bleach and cool air from the walk-in, and he laid out the volunteer sign-in binder on the table like a lay preacher, neat and careful. "I make copies of everything," he said, tapping the corner of the page with a clean nail. "Some folks think I'm fussy. Folks who show up on time don't mind." He turned the pages to the third Saturday of last month and pointed at my signature at 12:12 p.m. and again at 1:55 p.m. And then he showed me a second sheet with my name written in those same neat block letters I had seen at my desk, but the time was 2:35 p.m. and the pen was a darker blue. He lifted his cap, rubbed his forehead with the back of his wrist, and said that on that day he remembered locking the door at 2 and walking the side entrance to make sure the bins were covered. And a woman had knocked at 2:20 asking to drop off donations from her job, and he had let her in because she was crying and said her sister needed a signature for scholarship hours, and she had a family emergency. I set my elbows on my knees and stared at the floor until the pattern of the linoleum shifted. "I should have said no," he murmured. "I thought I was helping." She had the smile people use when they have practiced. He handed me a short typed note on pantry letterhead that said, in simple words, that the official hours ended at 2 p.m. The building was locked, and any after-hours signatures would be considered accidental and not valid. He signed it and added his phone number in case the PTA wanted to call. When I thanked him, my voice came out hoarse like I had been cheering at a game. He patted the table once and said, "You keep showing up. The rest of it will sort itself." That same evening, while the sky turned that deep blue you get after it rains and the air smelled like wet pavement and cut grass, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Aunt Denise because she is the only person in our family who rarely texts. I listened twice because the first time my brain skidded past the important part from shock. She had called to say she loved me and she hated being in the middle, and then she lowered her voice like she was standing in the laundry room with the dryer running and said she had heard something she thought I should know even if nobody wanted it said out loud. 2 days after my party, my mother had asked her for help with wedding paperwork, and Aunt Denise had driven over with her folder of stamps and return address labels because she is that kind of organized. And she found my shoebox on the hall table with my birth certificate copied and my social security card in a clear sleeve, and my mother had said, "I'm just consolidating the girls' important papers for the safe," and then later, when Mariah had left the room, she had whispered that she had lent my information to hold a venue quote because the place required a second adult signature, and it would all get transferred correctly once the deposit cleared, and it was only to hold a date, and you know how it is with bridal coordinators. They're so particular. My aunt said she argued, and my mother had bristled and said I was taking up oxygen with this independence project, and she can spare a little help for her sister. I sat on the edge of my bed, breathing carefully so I would not get dizzy. When Aunt Denise ended with, "I thought you deserved the truth, and I don't want your mother's fear to make me a liar by silence," I put the phone face down and let the cotton of my bedspread bunch under my hands, because I needed something solid to press into. The day after the voicemail, I drove to my parents' house because there was a steadying power in looking at people when they hoped you would look away. It was the third Friday of the month, the day before homecoming, and my father was in his chair watching pregame analysis, because that is how he unwinds before he has to deal with anything he cannot fix with a wrench. My mother was making a grocery list with a pencil that had teeth marks along the end, and she looked up with that tight smile that says company arrived at a bad time. "We have plans," she said, meaning the game on TV and a quiet night, and I said I would be brief. My heart thudded like I had speed-walked a mile, and I could feel the dampness on my palms even though the house was cool. "I need you to hear something and not interrupt for 1 minute," I said, and my father kept his eyes on the screen but tilted his head in a way that told me he was listening, and my mother sat back as if I had just told her a story she had not prepared for. I told them I had filed a police report for identity theft, that there was a buy now pay later account in my name from a boutique, that my pantry supervisor had written a statement about the closing time, and that the PTA would be contacting him. I did not raise my voice. I used the words case number and verification and documentation because those are the words that make people shift in their seats. My mother's face went pink and then pale, and she said, "You are going to ruin your sister's wedding with this," like she had practiced the sentence in private. I said I was going to protect my credit and my scholarship because these were mine. She stood and the list slid to the floor, and she said it had been a very stressful month and she had tried to take one thing off my plate by consolidating documents and smoothing the path, and sometimes adults had to make calls that children could not understand. I reminded her I was 18 and the bills with my name on them were not a misunderstanding. She tried again with the voice she uses on church committees when she wants to calm the room, and she said, "It would all have been corrected, and we had every intention, and why do you assume the worst of your own blood?" And I understood in that moment, without any voice in the back of my head arguing, that her fear of looking like she had failed had walked her into a room where she had chosen a lie that made her feel like a hero. My father said quietly, "This is a mess," and turned the volume down with the remote like he could lower the temperature in the room by clicking a button. Mariah came in from the hallway as if she had been summoned and did the bright smile that gets her through everything, and she said she had only used my name at the pantry because I had been unavailable and my hours had been short, and she had wanted us both to look good. And the store thing was a misunderstanding because the sales clerk had used the wrong account. She said the clerk's name like they were friends, and that made my stomach drop because I had watched that clerk's eyes widen when I said the date. I told her I had a case number and a letter and a copy of the form that showed 2 different pens, and her smile flickered like a candle when someone opens a door. She said I was dramatic and should have called her first, and I said I had been calling for 3 years and I was done. My mother said we were not going to drag our business into the street, and I said I was going to keep it on paper where it belonged. I left the house with a stack of envelopes from the hall table that had my name on them because my mail had not been redirected completely yet, and my father followed me to the porch and said, in a low voice that did not match his usual tone, that he had not known about the folder and he wished she had told him before she took it out of my box. He did not say he would fix it. He said, "I will drive you to the game if you want to get your mind off this," and I said I needed to go to work because the diner had me on for the evening shift. When I got to the diner, Lauren was at the counter with a study guide spread across the laminate, and she lifted her eyes with a careful expression that told me she had been afraid to call. "I overheard something at practice," she said once I had clocked in and poured coffee for a man in a mechanic's shirt at booth 3. She kept her voice low because people here know how to hear things they are not meant to hear. "Tyler's sister is dating a guy who works security at that venue by the river, the one your mother loves. And she said there was a weird situation with the contract for a Carter wedding where a second signer used a different social security number, and then a call came in 2 days later to switch the file over even though deposits have to stay put for 30 days. And that is not allowed." She thought it sounded like a mess and said she told her brother to steer clear. The veins in my wrists felt viable under my skin, like I could grab them to steady myself. I thanked her, and she reached out and touched the edge of my napkin with one finger, like she had to do it to keep from hugging me, because she knows I stiffen when someone grabs me without warning. "If you need me to sit with you while you do any of this," she said, "I will do it." I did not like being told to give you space, like it was a punishment, and that is on me for listening to my mother for a week. On the last Thursday before payday, which made exactly 3 weeks since my birthday, the PTA called to say that my scholarship payout was cleared and a check would be ready on Saturday morning at the band fundraiser breakfast. And I almost cried into the phone because the relief started in my gut and moved up my chest until my throat got tight, but I forced it down because there was work to do and crying would make my head hurt. They said they appreciated my organization and that Mr. Blake's letter had helped, and they said they would be reviewing sign-in protocols for next year, which is small-town language for "we are embarrassed," but we will not say names. After I hung up, I wrote an email that took me an hour because every sentence had to be a measured step and not an accusation that could be flipped back at me. I drafted it to the boutique's loss prevention address with the case number and the police report attached, and I copied the portion of the voicemail where Aunt Denise mentioned the lending of my information without using her name because I did not want to drag her into a mess she had tried to warn me about. When I pressed send, my hands trembled and the back of my neck felt hot, and I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the apartment window until my breathing slowed and I could hear the bus sigh at the corner. I thought for a second about texting my mother to say the PDA check had been approved because she always likes good news, but I did not because I had started to understand that the way she hears news is through the filter of what story she can tell other people. And I did not want this turned into a tale about a daughter who overcame adversity with the support of a loving family. I wanted the truth to sit in the middle of the month and take up space. The decision felt like pushing a box into the center of a room and standing back from it. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of the upstairs neighbor watching a sitcom and someone's dog barking at a raccoon by the dumpsters, and for the first time since I walked out with my duffel, I slept for 5 hours without a nightmare that left my shirt damp. The next morning, Friday before homecoming, I drove past my old house on the way to the diner because the route loops that way, and sometimes I like to know where people are without having to talk to them. The blinds were half open, and through the gap I could see my mother at the dining table with a stack of papers and a pen and a tight jaw, and Mariah across from her with her chin propped on her hand, scrolling. My father's truck was not in the driveway, which meant he had taken an extra shift or he was at the hardware store avoiding the house. As I came around the corner, I saw Mr. Dorsey dragging his trash can back up his driveway, and I slowed because he lifted a hand to wave and then pointed to his porch like he had something to say. I pulled over and rolled down the window, and he leaned in with his usual generous voice and said his doorbell camera had caught a little party traffic on the day of that birthday dust-up, and he had already sent the noise complaint clip to the neighborhood app because that is what he does, but then he thought a separate clip might be for me. He lowered his voice and said it looked like someone taking a small box out of the hall closet around the time the patrol car idled by because they had propped the front door a little too long, and the angle showed enough to be useful. He added that he does not like to get in people's business, but he once helped his niece with a similar situation when her roommate went through her things, and he had learned that sometimes people need a little recorded truth to stand on when the wind gets strong. I swallowed hard because my mouth had gone dry. I told him yes, please send it to my email, and he did not ask questions. He said, "Take care of yourself," and he squeezed my shoulder through the open window like uncles do when they want you to feel steady. When his email dinged 3 minutes later with the subject line "Porch Cam," keep your head up, I pulled into the library lot to watch because I needed a quiet place to feel whatever I was going to feel. The clip began with the mundane image of my own front door half open and the sound of voices distant enough that the camera picked up only the tone and not the words. Then Mariah came into frame with her hair twisted up and sunglasses perched on top, carrying my shoebox tucked against her waist like a parcel, and she moved fast in that way that looks like purpose until you notice the glance over the shoulder. And then my mother appeared behind her with 2 folders and a zippered pouch with the church logo, and she said something that made Mariah laugh, and they closed the door with a careful hand so it would not slam, and the image froze for a second on my mother's face in the gap, a look I cannot describe without either softening it or making it harsher than it was. I sat with my thumb on the play bar and the smell of old books drifting in from the library vestibule, and I understood that the line between a tantrum and a crime had been crossed in daylight while the neighbors trimmed hedges and the baseball game warmed up on TV. And the only reason it had stayed quiet was because I had been quiet. I lifted my head, put the car in drive, and went to work because I still needed the tips from the breakfast rush, and because revenge, if you can even call it that, is just another word for finally telling the whole story with no space left for anyone to rearrange your words. Friday night at the diner pushed everything tight and fast, the way homecoming weekends do when every table fills with kids in jackets and dads in team sweatshirts and mothers with phones out to catch the first pancake flip. I kept my head down, moved with the rhythm of coffee, plates, tickets, and the steady hiss from the flat top, and when the door opened every few seconds, a sweep of cold air slid across the floor and wrapped around my ankles. Under the counter, I had a paper bag with 9 envelopes inside, each labeled in neat letters I had traced twice to keep my hand steady, and inside each one I had put a copy of the police case number, Mr. Blake's letter about closing times, screenshots of my dispute, my own statement in simple lines, and a cheap flash drive with Mr. Dorsey's porch video because a picture fixes what words can wiggle out of. I had 2 envelopes with my parents' names because it felt important not to lump them. One for the PTA chair because checks require clean paper trails. One for the boutique loss prevention address because their manager had asked for details. One for the city clerk with a printout of my fine receipt and a short note that said thank you for your work because I wanted to show up as the kind of person who doesn't need a reminder. One for the venue manager who had a habit of double-checking signatures because she has seen too many stories. One for myself because I needed to prove I could hold my own paper. And one for the fiancé because I had decided that if anyone deserved the full picture before their life got rearranged in front of them, it was the man who would be stuck paying deposits and smoothing a mess he didn't make. The next morning, the band fundraiser breakfast turned the high school cafeteria into a wide, bright room full of the smell of syrup and sausage and kind voices. And I took a seat along the back wall with Lauren because she has a way of taking up steady space without pushing, and when the PTA chair stepped up to the microphone to announce the student awards, I felt the heavy coin roll of my heartbeat settle low and slow where it couldn't trip me. They called my name and a few people clapped like they meant it because they had seen me carrying half the pantry's produce last fall, and I walked up with my palms dry because I had wiped them on a napkin, and Mrs. Klein put the check in my hand with a soft smile that made her whole face younger, and she said, "Well done, and yes, we have your documentation on file," and those last words reached places inside me I hadn't known were tense until they loosened. I said thank you and turned and almost ran right into my mother because she was at the end of the line with a folder and the tight jaw that meant she had rehearsed something in the car, and behind her stood Mariah with the smile she uses when she wants to gather sympathy before anyone hears the facts, and to the side of them, half in the doorway, stood the fiancé with his hands in his pockets like a man who tells jokes when he's nervous and knows better than to start now. My mother said, in a tone I recognized from church committees when emotion needs a second, that she would take the check for safekeeping since I was working and had a lot on my plate, and I said, in a voice I didn't lift, that I was going to the bank down the block on my break and I had it covered, and I handed her the envelopes with their names because some stories are better told in writing when the room is full of humans with pancakes and kids practicing scales in the hallway. She blinked, like she had been handed a hot plate and didn't want to drop it where anyone could see, and Mariah reached for my elbow the way she does when she wants to guide me toward a corner, and I stepped aside because I was done being steered. The fiancé cleared his throat and asked if he could talk to me in the lobby for 5 minutes because he had received an email from the venue manager that morning with the words irregularities and verification. And he didn't understand what any of this meant, and I said yes, and we walked together past the trophy case where the football photos glared under fluorescent lights. He looked tired. Older than I remembered from the engagement dinner I was supposed to celebrate and couldn't because my sister had glued herself to the center of every conversation, and he said that last week he had put a deposit on a tent and some chairs and the venue had called to confirm, the second signer, because a social security number hadn't matched. And when they asked for clarification, my mother had called back with a different story, and now they had put the file on hold until someone provided clear identification, and then he looked at the envelope in my hand with his name on it and asked if he should open it now or later. I told him to open it now because delayed pain spreads, and he slid his finger under the flap like a man opening a letter from a college he didn't think he'd get into. And he read the 2 pages I had typed and the bullet points I refused to make into bullets because the rules said no lists, and he watched the porch video on my phone without taking it out of my palm. And when it ended, he took a deep breath and pressed his lips together hard enough to lighten the color, and he handed me back my phone like it was breakable. He said he needed to talk to her privately, and I said that was his call, and he asked me, in a careful voice, if I would send him everything by email so he couldn't lose it, and I said yes. He thanked me in that kind way people use when they know a thanks won't fix anything, and he walked back into the cafeteria with a posture I recognized from men at church who go in to face bad news without making a scene. By noon, after I had deposited the check and washed my hands twice because syrup clings, my phone buzzed with a call from the boutique manager, who said their system had flagged the account in question, and they had provisionally reversed charges pending the investigation and locked out any further purchases tied to my profile. She added that the footage at the register had been pulled and would be made available to the detective, and she apologized for the inconvenience with a tone that told me she has to say those words too often. I thanked her for doing her job and hung up, and then a new email rolled in from the venue manager with 3 sentences that did more than any long speech could do. They were closing the file for the Carter booking for failure to provide consistent identification. The deposit was being held under their 30-day policy and then would be released to the original payer less the standard processing fee. And any rebooking would require in-person verification by both parties. I read it twice and felt a shaky laugh rise and then steady because it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like returning a mislabeled box to the right shelf. By late afternoon, the quiet plan I had laid out on paper met the noise of my family's fixed story in a way that made the air feel thick enough to slice, because my mother called and went straight to a tone that vibrated the speaker, saying I had embarrassed her in front of the PTA and sabotaged my sister's wedding and humiliated the family with police reports and emails to strangers. And I listened until she had exhausted the part she had memorized, and then I said that the choice to use my name on a contract and at a store and at a pantry had not been mine, and that I had paid my own fine and deposited my own check and sent my own documents, and I would no longer be reachable for conversations that began with accusations and ended with, "You just don't understand," and I would be happy to talk later with a counselor or at a mediation because adults use structure when they cannot find their way out of the same hallway. She said she didn't need mediation in her own family, and I told her. That was her decision, and when the silence stretched, I could hear in the background the dull thud of a cupboard door and the low volume of the pregame show because my father doesn't mute until someone cries, and I said I hoped she ate something and got some rest. And I ended the call before she could start the next loop. That night at the diner, the game played on the small TV near the pie case, and the regulars cheered at the right times, and around 8, my father slid into a booth by the window and waited for me to notice. Which I did because I had been expecting either him or Aunt Denise, and when I brought him coffee, he said he didn't know where to start, so he would start with the easy part. And he set my shoebox on the seat across from him and pushed it forward with 2 fingers so the corner tapped my thigh. I knew from the weight that the folder inside had been restored to full thickness, and when I lifted the lid, the neat stack of documents and photos sat like they had never been touched. Except for the new small envelope on top with my name and the spare key to my old house and a post-it that said, "For you, not for borrowing," in his careful block print. He said he was not going to choose sides because that never helped when his brothers were at each other back in the day, but he had told my mother that the next step was hers, not mine, and he had told my sister she could call him when she had something to say that fit between 2 true sentences, and he would not be paying fees for contracts she had signed without telling people whose names she had used. Then he looked at me like a man looking over a roof he didn't know if he could afford to fix and said he hoped I would still come by for Sunday dinner when I felt like it because he missed the sound of me arguing with the TV about baseball, and I told him I'd think about it, and he said thinking was a good step. On the last Monday of the month, the detective called to say he had watched the boutique footage and confirmed an ID that would go into his report, and the buy now pay later account had been officially removed from my credit. And he advised me to keep monitoring and to consider freezing my file for a while, which I did that afternoon on the library computer. The PTA sent me a short note thanking me for my service hours and asking if I would consider speaking to the junior volunteers about documentation, and I said yes, because kids listen better when somebody just slightly older tells them the rules. The venue manager CC'd me on a courteous email to my mother stating that any future booking would require both parties in person with valid IDs and independent payment methods, which read like a stranger telling my family that the open tab had closed. Aunt Denise texted me a single line that said, "Proud of you, and I am here," and I stood in my kitchen and let the text sink in while the kettle clicked and softened, because sometimes a small sentence holds back a wave. I did not go to the next family planning meeting or the new venue tour because it wasn't mine to save, and I did not scroll through my sister's posts even when Lauren sent screenshots with captions about betrayal and jealous people. And I did not answer when old neighbors asked in kind voices if there was anything they could do except tell them to keep being the kind of people who show up when someone needs an extra folding chair. I went to work, to class, to the pantry on the second Saturday, and then to church once, sitting in the back where the fan squeaked and the usher smiled with tired eyes because he remembered me from when I'd been shorter. And I listened to a sermon about small steps and old habits and the way people change in tiny movements you don't see until one day you turn and they're standing somewhere else. When I walked back to my apartment, the leaves had started to crisp at the edges, and the neighbor's dog had found a spot of sun by the dumpster and was asleep with one paw over his nose, and the air felt like a clean shirt out of the dryer. And my shoulders dropped without me telling them to. The ending wasn't fireworks or a parade or a speech at a microphone. It was me unlocking my door in the early dark of a Monday night and setting my shoebox on the shelf where it belonged. It was me sliding the spare key into a drawer and labeling it with a date so I would remember. It was me sending one last email to the fiancé with the subject line, "For your records." and then taking his number out of my phone because his life wasn't mine to monitor. It was me paying the next month's rent with. The PDA money and my tips bundled and counted tens that smelled like every table I'd wiped this month. And it was me lying down on my small bed with the window cracked and the sound of the late news drifting up from the apartment below and the smell of someone's toast burning in another unit, and knowing that revenge, if that's the word, looked like a girl who stopped arguing with people who required a fantasy to sleep at night and who let the truth do its slow work in offices and inboxes and small crowded rooms where checks get handed out and people clap because they see you there. I did not fix my sister's tantrums or my mother's fear of looking like she failed. I watched them from a distance that measured about 2 miles and a few passwords. And I learned to breathe through the strange quiet that comes after a month like that. And when my father texted a photo of the baseball game and a line that said, "You were right about the bullpen," I laughed, turned off the lamp, and let the dark be just the dark, not a place where I had to hide.